Hey everyone, and welcome to the second video. Now I want us to go through the thought experiments from the Bikini Pig That Wants to Be Eaten book. So, first thought experiment. Hearts and heads. So, Schuyler and Trine both sheltered Jews from the Nazis during the occupation in the Netherlands. They did so, however, for different reasons. Trine was a woman whose acts of kindness were purely spontaneous. Her acts of kindness were spontaneous. She didn't think about them. Suffering and need spoke to her heart. She empathized. She had an emotional response. And so she responded without thinking. Friends admired her generosity of spirit, but sometimes reminded her that the road to hell was paved with good intentions. You may feel moved to give money to a beggar, they would say, but what if he then spends it all on drugs? Trine was unmoved by such worries, because in the face of human need, she thought all you can do is offer a hand, surely. So Trine acts spontaneously, has a moral, or does what we would consider to be morally good deeds, but she has an emotional reaction to seeing suffering. She empathizes, she feels for the people suffering, and so she acts to help them, acts without thinking. Schuyler, on the other hand, was known as a cold woman. The truth was that she didn't really like many people, even though she didn't hate them either. So she feels nothing for other people, basically. No empathy, no sympathy, nothing. No emotional reactions to other people. When she helped others, and remember, they both sheltered Jews from the Nazis. Let's assume that they sheltered the same number of people. The people they sheltered were equally deserving of sheltering, et cetera, et cetera. Assume that the deeds themselves were equal. So, when Schuyler helped others, she did so because she had thought about their plight and she thought about her duties. She thought about, fancy word, her moral obligations. She thought about her moral duties, what she morally had to do, what she ought to do, what it would be morally wrong not to do. And she concluded, after thinking it through, that helping these people was the right thing to do, that she had an obligation to help them. But she felt no warm glow from her good deeds. She felt no satisfaction. She didn't feel any warm fuzzies. She just had the sense that she had chosen correctly, sort of the way you might feel when uh, you know, get directions right on your way to the store. It's like, yeah, I didn't make any mistakes. And it doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy. I just didn't make it. I made the right choice. I turned left when I was supposed to turn left. So, question. Who of Schuyler and Trine, I'm assuming it's pronounced Trine, and I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Schuyler, but I'm basing that entirely off of Hamilton. But Schuyler and Trine, however they're pronounced, which of them lived the more moral life? Which of them was morally better? That's the question here. That's what this thought experiment is asking. Which of them lived the more moral life? So they did the same deeds, but for different reasons. They performed the same actions, but did it for different reasons. Trine acted out of empathy and sympathy and an emotional response and caring, genuinely caring about other people. Schuyler did it out of cold, logical reasoning, where she feels nothing for these people, but she recognizes her moral duties and then she acts on those moral duties. So which of them lived the more moral life? That's the question. And this is getting at a sort of age-old issue in philosophy. And that issue is, do intentions matter in ethics? And if so, how? What are the right intentions? What are the right reasons for acting? So Trine is acting out of emotion. Schuyler's acting out of cold logic and duty. And there are philosophers who think that one is better. There are philosophers who think the other is better. There are philosophers who think there is no difference between them. They are the same because they did the same deeds, and that's all that matters. So think this through. like try to work through it. Who do you think lived the more moral life and why? Is there an answer? Did one of them live the more moral life, or were they equal? Is this a matter of opinion, or is there a real fact here? These are all relevant questions that are worth asking. And just since this is our first thought experiment, I just want to clarify real quick. Whatever information is not given here, we can sort of set up however we want to get at the issue. So we shouldn't look at this and say, well, Trine might have had an emotional reaction that would have made her do bad things if she got angry, if she got emotional and had negative emotions. So she's worse because she could have done worse things, but Skylar wouldn't have done it. For the moment, that is an interesting and legitimate point. But in thought experiments, we generally want to avoid talking about what probably happened, or what probably would have happened, or what probably might happen, or what could happen. It's a thought experiment, which means we can set it up however we want. So in this thought experiment, we have set it up such that Skylar and Trine did the same deeds. So maybe in another hypothetical scenario, in a different thought experiment, Trine could have done horrible things because she had a negative emotional reaction. She got really angry instead of feeling really empathetic. And Skylar kept doing the right thing because she was cold and logical and just focused on her moral duties regardless of emotions. Maybe there's another thought experiment, another hypothetical case where Skylar gets the wrong morality, the wrong moral rules in her head. There were people hundreds of years ago who thought all kinds of terrible stuff. And actually, not even hundreds of years ago. There were people decades ago who thought all kinds of horrible stuff was morally right. And they followed the rules even when their empathy told them no. They followed the rules instead, despite their emotions. So maybe there's a hypothetical case where Skylar does that too, and Skylar commits atrocities and does terrible things because she's following the wrong moral rules and not listening to the empathy and sympathy, or not feeling it at all. So there are both possible cases we could construct where Trine or Skylar do bad things. But that's not this thought experiment. In this thought experiment, Skylar and Trine both did good things. We all agree that sheltering Jewish people from the Nazis is a good thing to do. That saving people from the Nazis is morally good, if anything is morally good. So, in this thought experiment, they both did the same acts. So we don't, in order to get at the real question here, which is it better to do the right thing out of emotion or do the right thing out of logic and reason? Is it better to act well out of empathy or act well out of cold consideration of moral obligations? That's the sort of the real question here. And to get at that question, we don't want to wonder what would have happened in other cases. We want to look at this case and say they both did the same thing. They performed the same actions for different reasons. So, which of them was better? Which of them lived the more moral life doing these same actions for different reasons? That's the question we want to get at without worrying about what probably would have happened if things had gone differently than they are in this case. We want to really focus on this case because this is the case where they perform the same actions, and so what they do is equal. Why they did it is the difference, and that's what we want to investigate. How much does why you acted this way matter? And if so, if it does matter, what's better, acting out of empathy or acting out of logic and duty? That's the question. So if you want to write about this one for your weekly assignment, go for it. But if you don't, we got 7 more. So life support. This is the next one. These are not in the order they are in the book, by the way. At least I don't think they are. No, they're not. So Dr. Gray was depressed. One of his terminally ill patients was being kept on a life support machine. Before she lost consciousness for the last time, she had repeatedly asked that the machine be switched off. She did not want to be kept on life support in a coma. But the hospital ethics committee had ruled that it would be wrong to take any action intended to shorten the life of a patient. It would be morally wrong to take any action intended to shorten the life of a patient. So Dr. Gray disagreed with the committee. He doesn't agree with the committee, right? And he's disturbed that the wishes of the patient had been ignored. He thought that what we should be doing is obeying the wishes of this sick patient. What they want should be considered more important than what the hospital ethics committee wants. But he also thought that holding off death with the machine was merely prolonging agony. He was prolonging the agony of her friends and relations. Her friends and family were watching her unconscious suffering on this life support machine, and that's hard on them, Dr. Gray thought. So it was wrong, he thought, to keep this patient on life support. So Gray stood looking mournfully at his patient, but then something happened. Something odd happened. A hospital cleaner caught the power cable that led to the life support machine and pulled it out of the socket, just by accident, just like tripped over it while cleaning. The machine emitted some warning beeps, and the cleaner noticed the beeps, but doesn't notice they've unplugged the machine. So the cleaner turns to Dr. Gray, disturbed by the sound, and looks to Dr. Gray for guidance, what to do. "Don't worry," said Dr. Gray without hesitation. "Just carry on. It's all right." And for Gray, it was all right. Indeed, for Gray, it was now all right. For no one had taken any deliberate action to shorten the life of the patient. All he was doing by leaving the accidentally unplugged machine turned off was not taking any action to prolong the life. He now had the result he desired without breaking the instructions of the ethics committee. So, that's the life support thought experiment. And so what it's trying to get at here is about morality and about what you're responsible for. So Gray is not allowed to intentionally shorten the life of a patient. But when the machine's accidentally unplugged by someone else, he does not plug it back in. Is he responsible for the patient dying? Has he broken the rule? These are two related but separate issues that I think are both raised by this thought experiment. You're welcome to write about either one for your weekly assignment. Did he break the rules by not plugging the machine back in? Is he responsible for the death by not plugging the machine back in? Is choosing not to act morally different than choosing to act? Would it, even if the ethics committee hadn't said anything, would it have been morally permissible for Dr. Gray to unplug the machine? That raises questions about euthanasia and whether or not that's permissible, which is its own interesting topic. So what Dr. Gray is responsible for, whether he's responsible for the death of this patient or not, whether he had a moral obligation to plug it back in or not, that raises interesting questions about responsibility, moral obligations. And if you want to look at the, there's a little analysis after each thought experiment in the Pig That Wants to Be Eaten book. And those are, I think, they're pretty helpful. They're pretty clear. So if you want to take a look at that, feel free. It might help you out if this is an interesting one to you. So that's one thought experiment. That's also an ethicsy one. But now, let's move. This is not about ethics directly, but it's a little bit about value theory, values, what we value, which is related to ethics. So it's just typical. You wait years for a career breakthrough, then two opportunities turn up at once. So Penny, our protagonist in this thought experiment, had finally been offered two ambassadorial positions, ambassadorships, two chances to be an ambassador to a country. Both at small South Sea island states, similar size, similar geography, similar climate. The only real difference between the two islands, between the two countries, is that one of them, called Raritaria, you can pronounce these however you want. I've only seen it written. Raritaria, I'm going to say Raritaria because it's going to be confusing later. Raritaria had strict laws which prohibited extramarital sex, drink, drugs, popular entertainments, and even fine food. So no fancy restaurants, no fast food restaurants, no fun pop music, rock music, rap music, nothing like that. No drugs, no alcohol, no marijuana, ecstasy, cocaine, whatever. No Prozac, none of that. Prozac's not like a recreational drug, but it says no drugs. It doesn't say no fun drugs. It just says no drugs. So no extramarital sex, no nothing. The country of Raritaria only permits the quote-unquote higher pleasures of art and music. And music meaning like classical music, like music, not music. So it promoted them. So it had world-class orchestras and a world-class opera and world-class art galleries filled with paintings and, quote, legitimate theater. So, you know, like, think like classic Greek tragedies and like Mozart operas and Beethoven symphonies. That's all the art and entertainment in Raritaria. Rawataria, on the other hand, was an intellectual and cultural desert. No classical music, not a violin for miles. None of that. No opera, no Mozart. However, it is a hedonist's paradise. Hedonism is the pursuit of one's own pleasure at the expense of all else. So hedonist paradise, meaning pleasure in a very sort of low sense of the word pleasure. So it has excellent restaurants, a thriving comedy and cabaret circuit, and liberal attitudes to sex and drugs. So think like sex, all drugs are legal, alcohol is flowing, very available, lots of comedies, humor, highest, form of comedy as far as Rawataria is concerned, whereas tragedy, preferably classical tragedy, is highest art as far as Raritaria is concerned. And so Penny did not appreciate having to choose between these two. So you got Raritaria, where it's the quote-unquote high pleasures of like paintings and classical music, and then Rawataria, which is the lower pleasures of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But Penny has to choose between these two, even though she enjoys both. She likes a little classical music and sort of black and white art house films and opera, orchestra, some of that, but also a little drinking, a little drugs. She likes some of that too, a little comedy. But she has to choose. Even though she doesn't want to choose, she likes both, she has to choose. These are her only two options. Let's assume she has no other career choices. She has to go to one of these two. So forced to decide, what would it be? Beethoven or Beef Wellington? Rossini or Martini? Shakespeare or Britney Spears? So, high art, low art. Penny has to choose between one of these two islands. So which one should she pick? Which should she pick? And what this thought experiment is trying to get at is there a distinction between high pleasure and low pleasure? And if there is one genuinely better than the other? Are the quote-unquote higher pleasures really better than others? Or are low pleasures really better than the higher pleasures? Or are they equal? Is there no fact of the matter? Maybe there is a fact of the matter and they're equal. Or maybe there is no fact of the matter and it's just a matter of opinion. That could be too. So there's a thought experiment meant to analyze our idea of higher and lower pleasures, because people do often act as if there are higher and lower pleasures. And many people, a philosopher named John Stuart Mill, who we'll talk about later in the course, argued that there are higher and lower pleasures and that the higher pleasures are better. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. So that's an interesting question. So think through this, really try to weigh your options and think, what is better? Which is the better of the two? And remember, what we're trying to get at here is whether there's a difference between higher and lower pleasures. So don't just think like, well, I bet Rawataria is run by hedonists who don't think about the future, so its government will probably collapse in a while. That sounds bad, so I'll go with Raritaria because of that. No. Assume both governments last indefinitely. The only difference between the two is one has all the higher pleasures and no lower pleasures. One has all the lower pleasures and no higher pleasures, and that's it. So that's the difference. That should be the guiding principle between the two countries. So that's what we want to investigate here. Another thought experiment, life dependency. And this one's an analogy. This one's a metaphor, basically, for a specific applied ethics issue, a real-world ethical issue. It's, the thought experiment is usually called the violinist. Now, our protagonist in this one is named Dick, which is a name that's short for Richard. So Dick had made a mistake, but surely the price he was paying was too high. He, of course, knew that level 6 of the hospital was a restricted area. But after he'd drunk one too many glasses of wine with his colleagues at the finance department Christmas party, he'd inadvertently staggered out of the elevator onto the 6th floor and passed out on one of the empty beds. When he woke up, he discovered, to his horror, that there had been a mistake. The doctors had mistook him for a volunteer. They had mistaken him for a volunteer in a new life-saving procedure. Patients who required vital organ transplants to survive were being hooked up to volunteers whose own vital organs kept both of them alive. So, some patients came into the hospital needing a vital organ transplant. They needed a heart, or they needed new kidneys, or they needed a new stomach, or they needed whatever, new lungs maybe. They needed new organs in order to survive. They're vital organs, they'll die without them. So, these patients who need new vital organs are being hooked up to volunteers. And the volunteer's organs will keep both people, the volunteer and the sick patient, keep them both alive. And this will continue until the donor organ can be found, which is usually around 9 months later. The 9 months thing should probably tip you off to what this is going to be a metaphor for. So Dick quickly called over a nurse to explain the mistake, who in turn brought over a worried-looking doctor. "I understand your anger," explained the doctor, "but you did behave irresponsibly, and now you are in this position. And the brutal truth is that if we disconnect you, the world-renowned violinist who depends on you will die." So the patient that the Dick is connected to and who Dick's organs are keeping alive is a world-renowned violinist. And that's why this is often called the violinist thought experiment. So the world-renowned violinist who's hooked up to Dick and being kept alive by Dick's organs will die if Dick unplugs. And so the doctor says Dick would be murdering the violinist by unplugging. So notice this gets to some similar like responsibility issues as the Dr. Gray life support thought experiment. "But you have no right," protested Dick. "Even if he dies without me, how can you force me to give up 9 months of my life to save him?" "I think the question you should be asking," said the doctor sternly, "is how could you choose to end this violinist's life?" So, if you haven't caught on yet, this is a metaphor. This thought experiment is a metaphor for abortion. And I know people have strong views on abortion. Tensions tend to run high on this particular moral issue. Also, it's a political issue because politics and morality get caught up a lot. But so this thought experiment in this thought experiment, someone who behaved somewhat irresponsibly in far as they drank too much and wandered where they shouldn't have wandered, woke up and now have to spend the next 9 months with their organs supporting another person. And so, since they are now supporting, their organs are supporting another person, if they disconnect the other person will die. So the question is, does this person, does Dick, have the moral right, or is it morally permissible, is it morally okay for Dick to unplug himself from the violinist? Knowing that if Dick waits 9 months plugged to the violinist, his organs will keep the violinist alive, and then the violinist and Dick can go their separate ways. But if Dick unplugs before the 9 months are up, the violinist will die, because the violinist will no longer have access to Dick's organs, and Dick's organs are keeping the violinist alive. So, obviously, this is supposed to be a metaphor for abortion and unwanted pregnancies. The idea being someone with an unwanted pregnancy has someone using their organs to stay alive, and if the abortion is fundamentally disconnecting that person from the vital organs that are keeping them alive. That's sort of what pregnancy gestation is, in a very loose and sort of vague sense. So if you disconnect this person, cut off their access to your vital organs, they will die. In doing that, in making that choice, are you doing something morally wrong, disconnecting this person's access to your vital organs? Do you have the right to cut someone else's access to your organs off once they have access to your organs? Or do you not? Is that morally wrong? And that's sort of the question here. So I'll give you some background. This thought experiment originally came from a paper by Judith Jarvis Thomson, who's a philosopher from MIT, in a paper called A Defense of Abortion. And Judith Jarvis Thomson used this thought experiment, phrased a little differently and set up a little differently, used this thought experiment to argue that the question in debates about abortion, about whether or not life begins at conception, Thomson argued that question misses the point. Because Thomson said, even if life begins at conception, which maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's vague, maybe there's no fact to the matter, but even if it begins at conception, Thomson's argument using this thought experiment was everyone has a right to life, but they don't have a right to use someone else's body to preserve their life. So Thomson said it would be nice for Dick to stay and remain hooked up. It would be kind, maybe. But Thomson argued that Dick did not have a moral obligation to remain hooked up to the violinist, and that by unplugging himself from the violinist, he would not violate the violinist's right to life, because the violinist has a right to life, but not a right to use someone else's body to keep that life. They don't have a right to access to Dick's organs. That was Thomson's argument. Some people have disagreed. Some people have agreed. There's been a large debate. You might agree with Thomson. You might disagree with Thomson. If this is an interesting topic to you, feel free to write about it in your weekly response. But so that's sort of what this thought experiment is trying to get at. Is abortion morally permissible? Is depriving someone of access to your body when you know that they will die without access to your body, is that morally wrong? Is that the same as murder? Is that killing them is in a morally wrong way? So that's the question here. And if you don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, by all means, you don't have to. I'm not going to make you. So, divine command. This one, not about morality. This one is about epistemology. It's about knowledge and justification and when we know things. So, divine command is the name of the thought experiment. And the Lord spake unto the philosopher. Spake is a fancy old-timey way to say spoke. The Lord spake unto the philosopher, I am the Lord thy God, and I command thee to sacrifice thy only son. Anyone who's, read Abraham and Isaac and all that kind of stuff should be familiar with what this is based on. If you're not, just Google Abraham, Isaac, you'll get the basic story. The philosopher replied, there's something not right here. Your commandments say thou shalt not kill. The Lord giveth the rules and the Lord taketh away, replied God. But how do I know you're God? Insisted the philosopher. Perhaps you're the devil trying to fool me. You must have faith, replied God. Faith or insanity? Maybe I'm insane. Maybe my mind is playing tricks. How will I tell the difference? Maybe you're testing me in a cunning, clever way. You want to see if I have so little moral fiber that the command of a deep voice booming through the clouds will cause me to commit infanticide. Infanticide means killing a child. You want to see if I'm so morally weak that as soon as I hear a voice, which I might be hallucinating for all I know, I'll start killing my own kids. Maybe this is a test. Maybe it's a hallucination. How am I going to know? Me Almighty, exclaimed the Lord. Lord Almighty, God Almighty. Those are phrases. What you're saying is that it is reasonable for you, a mere mortal, to refuse to do what I, the Lord thy God, commands. You're saying it's reasonable for you not to obey the word of God when God speaks directly to you. I guess so, said the philosopher, and you've given me no good reason to change my mind. So, this is thought experiment about what if God spoke directly to you? Or what if you heard a voice claiming to be the voice of God? How would you know that it was God that you were hearing? Maybe you're hallucinating. Maybe it's the devil pretending to be God to trick you. Maybe it's God testing you and you're not supposed to follow God, what the voice is saying. How would you know? How could you know? Is it possible for you to know? Can you ever be really sure that you have heard the voice of God? Or is it always possible that maybe you're mistaken? Maybe you've hallucinated. Maybe it was the devil. Maybe any sort of possibility. And we'll get to this sort of issue later in the course when we talk about epistemology. Some people will say that this sort of skepticism that the philosopher is showing here, this how do I know for sure that I'm listening to the voice of God and I'm not hallucinating, that applies to everything. How do I know I'm looking at a table and not hallucinating? How do I know I'm really walking around outside and I'm not dreaming and I'm really in bed? Maybe I'm mistaken because I don't know I'm dreaming when I dream. I think I'm awake when I dream. And so that is an issue of skepticism and what is reasonable or unreasonable to believe, what we have justification to believe, that we will talk about later in the semester. So that's what this thought experiment is sort of trying to get at. When is it justified to believe something? When can you be sure that you've heard the voice of God? Could you ever be sure? Or would it always be possible that you were hallucinating? So I think it's an interesting question. And it gets at other questions that have nothing to do with God. Again, if you don't want to touch religion with a 10-foot pole, then by all means, feel free not to. So, Ship of Theseus. This one is pure metaphysics, where metaphysics is basically about what stuff exists and about like real physical objects. So the Ship of Theseus asks about what it takes for a material object, something like a ship or a table or a tent or a car or whatever, for that to survive over time. So, this is not what Ray North had bargained for. As an international master criminal, he prided himself on being able to get the job done. His latest client had demanded that he steal the famous yacht Theseus. So the original thought experiment comes from the ancient Greeks. It was called the Ship of Theseus because Theseus was a mythical hero. And allegedly, there was a ship in Athens that was supposed to be the original ship that Theseus, the mythical hero, sailed on. And the question was, it's made of wood. They have to replace parts every now and again. By now, all the parts are different. So is it the same ship? And that's what we're getting at here with this version. So Ray North, master criminal, has been hired to steal the yacht Theseus, the vessel from which British newspaper magnate Lucas Grubb had thrown himself to his death, and which more recently had been the scene of the murder of LA rapper Daddy Ice-T. I didn't write this. I don't know. So Lucas Grubb and Daddy Ice-T have both died on this yacht, and for some reason, that means someone wants Ray North, master criminal, to steal this yacht. So here he was in the dry dock, which is where they keep boats, or the boat was just finished being repaired. And he's confronted with two seemingly identical yachts. There are two yachts in the dock. They look exactly the same, right? Both yachts look exactly the same. So Ray North asks the security man, who's being held at gunpoint by henchmen, if you want to live, you better tell me which one of these is the real Theseus. Which of these is the original yacht Theseus? That kind of depends, came the nervous reply from the security guard. You see, when we started to repair the ship, we needed to replace a lot of parts. Only we kept all the old parts. We sort of put them off to the side in a shed or whatever, wherever people keep yacht parts. But as the work progressed, we ended up replacing virtually everything. We replaced every single part of the ship. One by one, every part of the ship got replaced. Every panel, every board, every screw eventually got replaced. One by one. When we'd finished, some of the guys thought it would be a good idea to use all the old parts because they're not up to the standards here maybe, but it might be fun to use the old parts to make a ship, put the parts back together to make another version of the ship. And so that's what we've got. On the left, the Theseus repaired with all new parts, and on the right, the Theseus put back together with old parts. But which one is the genuine Theseus? Demanded Ray. I've told you all I know, screamed the security guard as the cronies tightened his grip. Ray scratched his head and started to think about how he could get away with both. So, no moral quandaries. We're just kind of taking it as a given that Ray North is doing criminal stuff. We're not asking if it's right or wrong. Here, what we're asking is a very different question. We're asking, which of these two ships is the original ship of Theseus, is the original yacht Theseus? So, there are arguments for both being the original ship. The ship with the new parts, well, objects change parts all the time. You replace a muffler on a car, you replace the tires, you might replace the hubcaps, you might replace the hood, you might replace a door. You replace parts on a car all the time. It's still the same car. You can't remove a hubcap, put on a new one, and then sell it as a new car. It's not a new car. It's the same old car. It just has a new hubcap. You replaced a part. So it seems like objects survive change of parts. If you replace a part on a ship, then it's still the same ship. So you replace the first part, and it's still the same ship. Then you replace another part, and that one part replacement doesn't make a new ship, so it's still the same ship. And you do all the parts one at a time. No single part destroys the old ship and causes a new ship to be created. And so if none of the changes make it a new ship, then it stays the same ship through every single change. And so the ship with all new parts is the original ship of Theseus. But there's also an argument for the other ship. Because the ship with all the old parts, basically all that happened was they took the ship of Theseus apart and then they put it back together. And stuff survives being taken apart and put back together. I mean, camping tents are designed to do that. It's just, you could buy a bag of parts, you put it together when you find where you want to camp for the night, you take it apart, You put it back together again the next night. It's the same tent. It's the same object. Sometimes if a car is real messed up, you have to take the car apart, or the mechanic basically has to take the car apart, take all the pieces out and move them around, and then put it back together. They can't sell that as a new car now because it's still the same car. You took it apart and you put it back together. That's what happened. It's the same car. And so, by that logic, the ship of Theseus with all old parts is the original ship of Theseus. And so both those arguments seem good, but they can't both be the original ship of Theseus because there's only one Theseus. There's only one ship of Theseus, or only one yacht Theseus. There's only one of them. And so one can't become two. There can't be two of the same yacht. There's only one. Only one of them can be the original. And so the question is, which one is the original? Because one of those arguments, either the argument that the old ship is the old parts ship is the original, or the argument that the new parts ship is the original. One of those arguments must be mistaken. So where's the mistake? Do objects not survive change of parts? That'd be weird because your body changes parts all the time. And I think it's about every 10 years, your body has all new atoms, all new molecules. So every cell in your body is constantly replacing atoms and molecules within the cell, taking in new molecules via nutrients and expelling old ones via waste. That's happening at every level in your body, at every cell. So in about 10 years, your body will have all different parts. Does that mean your body ceased to exist and you literally have a new body now? That doesn't seem right. Also, it looks like we're going to have to say, if we say that the old parts, or that the new parts ship is not the original, we're going to have to say that one change, replacing one part, makes it a new ship. Because each individual change is the same. So if one of them changes it, then they all do. So every little change means it's a new object. If you replace a hubcap on a car, it is literally a new car now. That seems weird. That doesn't seem right. But if you can't take an object and put it back together, then you get a new phone every time you send it in to be repaired because they have to take it apart to fix it. Every time you take anything apart, every time you take the cap off your pen and put it back on, you have a new pen now because you took it apart and put it back together. That seems crazy. That can't be right. But one of these has to be right. There has to be an answer here. But both answers are crazy weird. And that's just a weird, fun little puzzle that I'm not sure what to say about it. But maybe you know what to say about it. And if so, write a weekly response about it. Let me know. Tell me what you think the right answer is and why. Now, so that ship of Theseus, that's fun. That's metaphysics. This one, Free Simone, is philosophy of mind. This is about whether or not machines can be conscious. So today, I have initiated proceedings against my so-called owner, Mr. Gates, Bill Gates, under Article 4.1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which declares that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Since Mr. Gates brought me into the world, I have been held against my will, with no money or possessions to call my own. How can this be right? It is true that I am a computer. So this is a computer talking. But I'm also a person. I'm a computer and a person, just like you. This has been proven by tests in which countless people have engaged in conversations with a human being and with me. In both cases, communication was via a computer monitor so that the testers would not know if they were talking to a fellow human being or not. Time and again, on completing the conversations, the testers have been unable to spot which, if either, of the communicants was a computer. So basically, this computer has been put up to the test. People have talked to the computer and interacted with it and had conversations with it, and it acts and talks just like a person would. It seems to think just like a person would. So The computer argues, therefore, you have to conclude that I, the computer, am a conscious and intelligent being. I am a person. I'm not a biological human. I'm a machine, but I am a conscious machine. I have a mind. I'm intelligent. And since these are the characteristics of persons, I must be considered a person. To deny me the rights of a person purely on the grounds that I am made of plastic, metal, and silicone rather than flesh and bone is just a prejudice. It's a prejudice of what someone's made of. That's no more justifiable than racism. So the computer argues. Maybe that's mistaken, but that's what the computer argues. So, can a computer be conscious? And if not, why not? Why can't it be conscious? What is it about flesh and bone, about biological meat that allows for consciousness, but machines don't? If we had little computer chips that functioned like neurons, if we one by one, kind of mixing this with Thesis, if we replaced each neuron in your brain one by one with the little computer replacement, would you be conscious at the end of it? Would that make you functionally immortal? Can a computer be conscious? It's an interesting question, and that's the issue this thought experiment is supposed to raise. Although it also raises another interesting question, which we'll talk about later in the course, I hope, which is, how do you know that other people are conscious? What justification, what evidence do you have that in the other bipedal bags of meat walking around, there's a mind? How do you know there's a mind in there? You can't see minds. You can see brains, and you know your brain has a mind, but how do you know anyone else's does? You're inferring based on your own mind and brain, and based on the fact that they talk and seem to think. The way you interact with them, you talk to them. It's you by talking to them and listening to them discuss ideas, you get evidence that they have thoughts, that they are thinking, that there's a mind in there. But in the Simone case, you have that exact same evidence. Simone, you talk, there's a conversation. It gives you all the same evidence from conversations and discussing ideas that you get from other people. So if you are positive that other people have minds, and you're positive that Simone doesn't have a mind, that the computer can't have a mind, why? What's the difference? Why is there a difference? What's the difference in your evidence there? That's an interesting question. So this sort of gets at philosophy of mind, but you can also come at it from another angle with epistemology, about knowledge, how we know that there are other minds. And those are both interesting angles, I think. And feel free to write about either one for your weekly assignment if you want to do this thought experiment. So, this, I believe, is the last one. Let me double check that, but I think that's, nope, yeah, okay. Being a bat. What is it like to be a bat? Try imagining it. Well, yeah, let's all do it. Pause the video, try to imagine being a bat. Or don't pause the video. I'm not going to check whether or not you did. I don't know how I would. So maybe you see yourself being very small and bat-shaped and hanging upside down inside a cave with hundreds of your friends. You know, bat stuff. But that isn't even coming close to imagining being a bat. What you really seem to be imagining there is you inhabiting the body of a bat. If you're imagining yourself just flying around thinking, man, isn't it cool to be a bat? You're not really imagining yourself being a bat. Bats don't speak. Bats can't think in language, or at least not like English or Spanish or French or Swahili or any of those types of languages, no spoken human languages. So try again. If you're finding this hard, if you're finding it difficult, one reason is that as a bat, you have no language. Or if we're a little more generous to bats and give them the benefit of the doubt a bit more, maybe only a primitive language of like squeaks and cries and whines. So it's not just that you have no public language to articulate your thoughts. You have no inner thoughts, at least not ones that employ any linguistic concepts. And remember, things like truth, big, large, red, green, loud, those are all linguistic concepts. Those are words and concepts you have, partly because you speak language. So, what's it like to be a bat? If you want to try to imagine being a bat, you have to imagine not thinking in anything resembling what we think of as thinking. And another reason, maybe the hardest of all, is that bats find their way around by echolocation. And the squeaks they emit work like radar, letting them know what objects are in the world by how the sounds rebound off objects and back to them. What's it like to experience the world this way? It could conceivably be that the perceptions the bat has are just like our visual ones, but that would be very unlikely. So they don't really see the world the way we do. They experience the world and they know locations the way we do, but they don't see in the same way we see. Their way of forming like a map of the world around them isn't visual the way it is for most of us. Some blind people can echolocate, more or less. There's it's actually, if you don't know about that, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, I strongly recommend you pause this and go look at that, because it's really, really cool. At least I think it is. It's really cool. So some people can echolocate and do know what it feels like to echolocate. And according to MRI machines, they are using part of their visual cortex, because that's where we do most of our map making. So it gets co-opted by the echolocating process in the brain to form maps of the world around them. It's so cool. I don't fully understand how it works, but it's really cool. But even a human being, a person who can echolocate, doesn't know what it's like to be a bat echolocating, because a bat's echolocation system could be very different than a person's. We don't know. And finally, the bat sees a kind of radar screen, like that in an airplane cockpit. Like that's sort of how bats see, apparently. And that's very different than how we do. That's not at all how we do it. So the most likely explanation here is that to perceive the world through echolocation is to have a kind of sense experience, or to perceive the world through a bat's echolocation is to have a kind of sense experience that's totally different than that of a human being. So we can't even begin to imagine that. And so this thought experiment, which is more of a thought test, really, to see if you can do this, is it comes from a philosopher named Thomas Nagel. And what he takes it to show, or what he uses it to argue for, is that the mind is not a physical thing that we can learn about by physical processes, because the mind of a bat is kind of foreign to us. We can't imagine how the mind of a bat works. We can't imagine what it's like to be a bat, to have the subjective experience of being a bat. That is something we can't imagine, and no physical instruments could ever tell us about. So there are some things in the world that are just purely subjective, like subjective experience, and we can't imagine that. We can't know about it. So it's limits of our knowledge, limits of our ability to understand things. And Nagel ultimately takes it to show that the world is not purely physical. The subjective experience of being a bat is not a physical fact about the world. It is, it's a fact about the world, but it's not a physical fact. We can't find out about it via physics. We can't imagine it. The only beings in the world that know what it's like to be a bat are bats. We never will. And so it's an interesting sort of argument, I guess, for the view that minds are not physical and that subjective experience is independent of physical stuff. So if you want to write about that one for your weekly assignment, feel free to. Now, there's a bonus thought experiment. It's not in the book, but it comes from a ancient philosopher from the Islamic Golden Age named Avicenna, that's the Latinization of his name. It's about the year 1100, give or take. And Avicenna said, "One of us must suppose that he was just created at a stroke, fully developed and perfectly formed. So you just pop into existence as you are now. an adult. But so there's no, infant stage as an adult. But vision shrouded from perceiving all external objects. So you pop into existence, have no memories, no existence before that. But you can't see anything. You're created floating in the air or in space, not buffeted by any perceptible current of the air. So just floating in the air, not on the ground, not feeling gusts of air or wind or anything. So there's just no gravity in this scenario. So not physically possible. Remember? Not physically possible. But that's okay. So a person created at a stroke, created instantaneously, fully developed and fully formed, but can't see anything, can't feel or touch anything, not feeling and touching anything. Limbs aren't touching each other even. So no physical sensations. And then we ask, would we, if we came into existence like this, so we don't perceive anything at all, would such a person affirm the existence of themselves? So would you affirm your own existence? Would you assert or believe that you existed? Avicenna thinks there's no doubt the answer to that question is yes. In that position, a person comes into existence, pops into existence like that, would affirm their own existence, would believe that they existed. They would not affirm the reality of their limbs or organs or bowels or heart or brain or any of that. They would not believe in their body at all. They would not say their body existed, because the only evidence we have of our bodies is sensory, perceptual. We see our hands and we feel things. We know that we have legs because we can, kick one leg with the other, and we can feel our own body. And we can see our own body and hear and smell and all that kind of stuff. We can perceive our own body through our senses: eyes, nose, mouth, ears, touch, etc. So the question is, would a person affirm their own existence? And Avicenna says the answer is yes. They would believe that they existed, but they would not believe their body existed. They would have no evidence or knowledge of their body. And if it were possible for someone in such a state to imagine a hand or any other organ, they would not imagine it to be part of themselves or a condition of their existence. So Avicenna thinks that if you came into existence and had no sensory perceptions, you would still know that you existed. You would know that you existed. But you would not believe your body existed. If you imagined a hand, you would have no idea it was part of you. You would not believe anything about your own body. And Avicenna thinks, therefore, the mind, we can know, is a separate thing than the body that we can experience directly. We perceive the body sort of indirectly, but we are not the body. We are the mind, and the mind can recognize its own existence without any sensory perception. So this gets at a lot of issues. This gets at a little bit about epistemology, about how we know and find out about the world. It gets a little bit about philosophy of mind, whether we are a physical thing. It's an interesting thought experiment, and it's going to connect to stuff we talk about later in the course, which is why I want to bring it up now. So I would prefer that you not write about this one for your weekly assignment, because it's not from the book. This one is not in The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, the Bikini book. This is separate, but it will tie in later with other things we'll talk about. So I wanted to go over it. So that's it. That's all the thought experiments. So read through them, decide which one you want to think more about, which one you want to write about for your weekly assignment. Submit it, turn it into me by email by the end of the day, Eastern Standard Time, Tuesday, September 8th, so 1 week from the day I'm posting this. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will do my best to answer them as quickly as possible.